The moment Ellen Morgan stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made either the bravest decision of her life or the most foolish one. And the way the hot wind cut across the barren street, lifting dust devils in lazy spirals and rattling the loose shingles on the saloon across the road, did very little to reassure her. She stood there on the packed dirt, her small leather trunk at her feet, her dark hair pinned beneath a practical bonnet that had seen better days, and she took stock of the town that was supposed to be her new life. Dusty Creek was exactly what its name promised. 2 rows of weathered buildings faced each other across a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, maybe 3 if the drivers were friendly. A mercantile, a livery, a blacksmith whose hammer rang out in the midday heat like a slow, tired heartbeat, a saloon called the Silver Bit with a painted sign that had faded so badly the letters were barely distinguishable, a sheriff's office with iron bars on the single window, a small church at the far end of the street, its white paint peeling in long strips, leaning very slightly to the left as though it had been meaning to straighten itself for years, but had simply not gotten around to it. None of it looked like the future she had imagined back in Cincinnati, Ohio, when she had answered the advertisement in the Western Frontier Weekly. The ad had been simple and direct. Rancher seeks capable woman of good character to manage household and assist with accounts. Correspondence required. References preferred. Marriage a possibility for the right arrangement. She had responded, and a man named Clifford Beale had written back with what seemed like genuine warmth, describing a sprawling cattle ranch, a comfortable house, a good life with honest work. He had sent her the fare. She had packed everything she owned, said goodbye to nothing worth keeping, and come. Clifford Beale, as it turned out, had died of a rattlesnake bite 3 weeks before Ellen arrived. This information was delivered to her by the postmaster, a small wiry man named Horace Finch, who looked at her with the kind of embarrassed sympathy reserved for people receiving very bad news in very public places. Got the letter sent to Cincinnati the same day he passed, Horace told her, turning his hat in his hands. Must have crossed paths with you somewhere on the road. I am awful sorry, miss. Awful sorry. Ellen stood very still for a moment, her hand resting on the lid of her trunk, and she did the arithmetic in her head. She had $11.40 in her coin purse. She knew nobody in Dusty Creek or in the entire state of Texas. The next stagecoach heading back east would not pass through for another 10 days. She had nowhere to stay, no employment, and no obvious solution presenting itself. Is there a hotel? She asked, because it seemed like the most practical first question. Mrs. Garrett runs a boarding house on the West End, Horace said. Reasonable rates, good cooking. Thank you, Ellen said, and she picked up her trunk herself because there was nobody else to do it, and she walked. She found Mrs. Garrett's boarding house without difficulty. It was a 2-story structure that smelled of boiled cabbage and lye soap, and something underneath both of those smells that was almost warm, almost like a home. Clara Garrett was a stout woman in her 50s with flour on her apron and sharp, kind eyes, and she took one look at Ellen standing in her doorway with a trunk and a set jaw and the particular expression of a woman who was not about to cry no matter what happened, and she said, "Come in, child. Put that down before you hurt yourself." Ellen set the trunk down and told Clara the whole story, plain and without ornamentation. Clara listened without interrupting, and when Ellen was finished, Clara poured her a cup of coffee and sat across the kitchen table from her. You can stay a week on credit, Clara said. After that, we find you some kind of work. Dusty Creek is not a generous town, but it is not an unkind one either. There are people here who could use a hand. I can cook, Ellen said. I can keep accounts. I learned bookkeeping from my uncle who had a dry goods business. I am good with numbers and I do not make mistakes. Bookkeeping, Clara said, with an expression that suggested she was turning the word over in her mind like a coin she was not sure was genuine. Well, that is unusual. But it might just be useful. She slept that first night in a small room on the second floor with a window that looked out over the backyard and a cottonwood tree whose branches scraped the glass when the wind picked up, and she lay awake for a long time listening to the sounds of a town she did not know, in a state that was not hers, thinking about what came next. What came next arrived the following morning in the form of Edgar Haskins. He came to the boarding house not looking for her specifically, but because he had a habit of eating breakfast at Clara Garrett's table on Tuesdays and Fridays when he was in town, as Clara's biscuits were the finest thing produced within 100 miles, and Edgar Haskins was a man with serious opinions about biscuits. He was 28 years old, which he carried the way a man carries something heavy but useful, with his broad shoulders squared and a kind of deliberate steadiness in how he moved. He was not beautiful in any conventional way. His jaw was too strong, his nose had been broken once and had not set perfectly straight, and his dark eyes were set beneath a brow that gave him an expression of permanent seriousness, the kind of look that made people in town treat him with respect and sometimes with a degree of caution. He wore his denim and canvas with the casual authority of a man who dressed for work and not for appearances, and his hat, a dark brown wide-brimmed affair, was pushed back on his head when he came through the door. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw Ellen sitting at the table. She looked up from her coffee. They regarded each other for a moment with the mutual wariness of two people who had not expected company. "Edgar," Clara said, coming in from the back with a pan of biscuits, "this is Miss Ellen Morgan, who is a guest of mine this week. Ellen, this is Edgar Haskins. He runs the Broken H Ranch, which is the biggest cattle operation in this part of the county. Sit down, both of you. Biscuits are ready." Edgar pulled out a chair across from Ellen, set his hat on the table and said, "Morning, miss." "Good morning," Ellen said. They ate breakfast across from each other, and Clara, who was nobody's fool, managed to be in the kitchen and the back room and the pantry for most of the meal, which meant that Ellen and Edgar were, for practical purposes, alone at the table together. Edgar ate the way he did everything else, with quiet efficiency and a kind of attention to the task at hand. But after the second biscuit he looked up at Ellen and said, "You came in on yesterday's stage." "I did," she said. "Heard about the situation with Beale," he said, not unkindly, just directly the way a man speaks when he figures that dancing around a thing does not improve it. "I am sorry about that. He was a decent enough man." "I did not know him personally," Ellen said. "Only through letters." Edgar nodded, processing this. "What do you plan to do?" It was a question she had been asking herself since the moment Horace Finch had told her the news, and she had an answer now, or the beginning of one. "I plan to find work," she said. "I can keep accounts and manage figures. I understand household management. I am not afraid of work." Edgar looked at her with those serious dark eyes, and she had the impression of being assessed with a kind of directness that was entirely absent of malice. He was not judging her. He was simply looking at the facts of her the way a man looks at terrain before deciding on a route through it. "My ranch books are a mess," he said. There was a pause. "I have not had anyone keeping proper records since my foreman took his family to California last fall," he continued. "I have been doing it myself, and I am not good at it. Numbers do not hold still for me the way they should." Ellen set down her coffee cup. "I am very good at numbers," she said. "Clara will vouch for your character, I imagine," he said, glancing toward the kitchen where Clara was conspicuously not appearing. "I believe she would," Ellen said. "It would be proper work," he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, deliberate, as though he wanted to be absolutely clear. "You would come out to the ranch 3 days a week, work in the office, go through the ledgers, and I will pay you fair wages. You can stay here with Clara. I will send one of my hands to bring you out and take you back." "What are fair wages?" Ellen asked, because she was a practical woman and she had learned from necessity to ask the questions that other people were too polite to bring up. He named a figure. It was more than she had expected. Not lavish, but honest. "All right," she said. They shook hands across the breakfast table, and Clara appeared from the kitchen at that precise moment with a fresh pot of coffee. wearing an expression of perfect innocence that convinced nobody. The Broken H Ranch was 12 miles north of Dusty Creek, situated in a wide valley where a creek ran clear and cold even in summer, fed by underground springs, and the grass came in thick and green along its banks and spread out in gentler waves across the surrounding land before the territory grew harder and more demanding at the edges. The ranch house itself was a long, low structure built of limestone and timber, with a covered porch that faced east to catch the morning light, and there was a solid practicality to it that Ellen recognized and respected. The house of a man who had thought about what he needed and built it without excess, but without stinginess either. Her first day there, Edgar's ranch hand, a young Mexican man named Tomás Reyes who could not have been more than 19, and who had a perpetual cheerful expression and a lively curiosity about everything, drove her out in a 2-horse wagon and pointed out landmarks along the way with the enthusiasm of someone who loved the land he lived on. "That red mesa, you see it," he said, pointing to a flat-topped formation to the northwest that glowed like coals in the morning light. "They say there is gold up there, but old Edgar, he says that is nonsense, and anybody who goes up there looking for gold is going to find nothing but rattlesnakes and disappointment." "And what do you think?" Ellen asked. Tomás grinned. "I think the rattlesnakes are probably true. The gold I am less sure about." She laughed, and it surprised her, the ease of it, the way it came without warning in the middle of all the uncertainty she was carrying. The office at the Broken H was a room off the main hall of the house, with a wide oak desk and 2 windows and 4 years of chaotic ledgers stacked on every available surface in an arrangement that could generously be called organic and more honestly be called catastrophic. Ellen stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment, and then she rolled up her sleeves and began. Edgar came in at noon with coffee and stood in the doorway watching her work, and there was something in his expression that she could not entirely read. Relief, she thought, and something else, something quieter and less easily named. "You have been writing figures in the wrong column," she said without looking up. "For at least 2 years. Your cattle sales are being entered against your expenses, which is why your accounts look like you are operating at a loss when, based on what I can see, you are actually turning a reasonable profit." There was a silence. "Well," Edgar said, "it is a simple error," she said. "It happens when someone does not have formal training. I can correct it across all the years if you would like, and going forward you will have accurate books." "I would appreciate that very much," he said. She looked up then and found him watching her with that serious expression that she was beginning to understand was not severity, but rather a kind of focused attention, the way a man looks at something he is genuinely interested in. "Your coffee is getting cold," she said. He came in and set it on the edge of the desk and left without further ceremony, and she went back to the numbers, and the afternoon passed in a comfortable quiet with only the scratch of her pen and the distant sound of cattle, and the occasional voice of a ranch hand outside to mark the time. This was how the arrangement began, and it had its own rhythm and its own logic, and it was entirely proper, and Ellen reminded herself of that regularly during those first weeks, because she was beginning to notice things about Edgar Haskins that had nothing to do with ledger books. She noticed the way he treated his hands, with a consistency and fairness that did not waver based on his mood. She noticed that he knew every horse in his stable by name and character and preference, the way another man might know his family. She noticed that he read, which was not as common as it should have been in a frontier ranching community, and that he kept a small shelf of books in the office, well-worn and well-read. She noticed that when he laughed, which was not often, it transformed his whole face into something generous and warm, and it always happened because something was genuinely funny, and not because he thought it was expected of him. She noticed these things, and then she noted that she was noticing them, and she put a firm hand on that particular door and held it shut. She was in Dusty Creek to build a life, not to entangle herself in complications. She had come west for a practical arrangement, and the practical arrangement had not worked out, and the current practical arrangement was doing very well, and she intended to keep it practical. This resolve lasted almost exactly 6 weeks. It broke on a Thursday evening in late April when a sudden storm came sweeping across the valley, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in 30 minutes and sending a wall of rain across the land so thick it was nearly opaque. Tamaz had brought Ellen out that morning on what was supposed to be a clear day, but the storm had come up faster than anyone expected, and by 4 in the afternoon it was clear that driving back to Dusty Creek was not going to be safe. Edgar appeared in the office doorway with the particular expression of a man who is about to say something he has been deciding how to phrase for several minutes. "The storm is going to last the night," he said. "We have a spare room. It would not be right to put you on that road in this." Ellen considered the rain hammering the windows and the quality of the light outside, which was the particular gray-green of serious weather. "I appreciate that," she said. "I hope it does not cause any difficulty." "It does not," he said, and the firmness in his tone suggested that anyone who thought otherwise was not worth his consideration. She helped the cook, a stout and supremely competent woman named Dora, with supper, because standing idle while other people worked was not something Ellen was constitutionally capable of. Dora accepted her help with pleased surprise and set her to peeling potatoes, while Dora handled the beef stew, and they talked in the comfortable way of two women who each respect a useful pair of hands. Supper was served in the dining room, and it was the first time Edgar and Ellen had sat across from each other at a table in something other than Clara Garrett's kitchen. The ranch hands ate in the cookhouse. It was just the two of them, which was entirely proper because Dora was in the kitchen and Tamaz was in the bunkhouse, and the rain was making such a continuous roar on the roof that the whole world seemed contained within the lamplight. They talked. That was the thing that surprised Ellen afterward, when she was lying in the spare room listening to the storm and replaying the evening. They talked the way she had not talked to anyone in a very long time, not since before her father died and left her with debts and a Cincinnati that no longer felt like home. They talked about books, and Edgar had opinions about books that were thoughtful and sometimes surprising, and not what she expected from a cattle rancher in the West Texas wilderness. He had read Darwin and Cooper, and he had an old copy of Bleak House that he had read 3 times and felt was the finest novel in the English language. "Not the cheeriest story," Ellen said. "No," he agreed, "but it is honest, and there is kindness in it, even in the middle of all the injustice. That counts for something." She looked at him across the table, and the lamp threw warm light across his face, and she thought that he was a more complicated man than he presented himself to be, and that the complication was interesting in the way that deep water is interesting, not threatening, just full of more than it shows on the surface. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He set down his fork. "You can ask," he said. "I reserve the right not to answer." "Why are you not married?" she said. "You have a good ranch, a stable life. Most men your age in this part of the world have a wife and several children." There was a pause that lasted longer than she expected. "I was engaged," he said, 3 years ago. Her name was Margaret. She was a good woman. She decided that Texas was not the life she wanted, and she went back to her family in Missouri, and I cannot honestly say I blame her. It is a hard life in ways that are not always apparent when you are imagining it from a distance. "Does it still hurt?" Ellen asked, because she was, at her core, a direct woman who preferred honest answers to comfortable evasions. Edgar was quiet for a moment, and the rain talked on the roof. "No," he said finally, and it sounded true rather than brave. "I think what hurt was the understanding that came with it, that what I could offer and what she needed were not the same thing." "That takes a while to make peace with." Ellen nodded slowly. "I understand that kind of peace," she said. He looked at her, and there was something careful and attentive in his look, the way a man looks at a landscape he is trying to read truly. "Your situation in Cincinnati," he said. "What were you running from?" she laughed, which surprised both of them. "Running toward," she said. "There is a difference. I had nothing left to run from in Cincinnati. I ran toward the idea of something different, something that could be built from scratch. The Beale situation was a setback, not a defeat." "That is a brave way to see it," he said. "It is the only useful way to see it," she said. The storm ran itself out sometime in the small hours, and by morning the valley was washed clean and very bright, the creek running full and the grass deep green, and the sky the particular clear blue that follows a hard West Texas storm, a blue so intense it seems almost aggressive. Edgar had her driven back to Dusty Creek in the morning, and nothing of great observable significance had happened. But something had shifted in the architecture of things between them, something that both of them were aware of and neither of them mentioned. The weeks that followed had their own quality. Ellen had settled into the routine of the Broken H with the ease of someone who was very good at her work and found satisfaction in it. The books were now in order, and she had begun to notice patterns in the cattle trade that suggested Edgar could improve his revenue by adjusting the timing of his sales to correspond better with market cycles. And she had brought this to him with a 2-page summary she had written in her careful hand, and he had read it with complete attention and asked intelligent questions, and then implemented her suggestions. And the results were satisfying in the quantifiable way that numbers made things satisfying. But she was also learning him in other ways. She saw him on horseback one morning, working a young cutting horse in the corral, and the grace and precision of it, the conversation between man and animal conducted entirely in movement and weight and breath, was something she could not stop watching. She saw him sit with Tamaz one evening on the porch after a day where Tamaz had made an error that had cost the ranch a small amount of money. And instead of anger, Edgar simply explained where the thinking had gone wrong and what to do differently, with a patience and thoroughness that clearly meant a great deal to the young man. She saw him read on Sunday mornings on the porch with his coffee, turning pages with the quiet concentration of a man in whom reading was a private act of nourishment. And she saw him watching her, sometimes, when he thought she was not aware of it, with an expression that she was increasingly certain was not simply professional regard. She talked to Clara about it. She had not intended to. It simply happened one evening when Clara was mending and Ellen was sitting in the parlor of the boarding house and trying to read and failing. And Clara, who had 40 years of watching people at close range, simply said, "You might as well tell me what is on your mind, Ellen. Carrying it alone is not improving your concentration." So Ellen told her, not everything, but the shape of it, that she was aware of feelings developing that had not been invited and were not entirely welcome because she was in Dusty Creek to build an independent life and not to become dependent on anyone. Clara set down her mending and looked at Ellen with the directness of a woman who respects people enough to tell them the truth. An independent life and a shared life are not mutually exclusive things, Clara said. The question is whether the person you would share it with understands that your independence is not a problem to be solved, but a quality to be respected. And do you think Edgar Haskins understands that? Ellen asked. Clara picked up her mending again. I think Edgar Haskins has been working his land alone for 3 years because he has not met anyone whose company improved on his own solitude, she said. I also think that he drove 12 miles each way twice last week to bring you ledger paper when you ran out, when he could have simply sent Tamaz. What do you make of that? Ellen made a great deal of it, and she made it alone in her small room with the cottonwood tree scratching at the window, and she came to the conclusion, which arrived quietly and without drama, that she was already in love with Edgar Haskins and had been for some time, and the only question remaining was what, if anything, to do about it. The decision was made for her, in a sense, by circumstances that had nothing to do with romance. In early June, a man named Cord Whitley and his 2 partners rode into Dusty Creek and began to make inquiries about land. Cord Whitley was a land speculator, and a man of considerable personal unpleasantness, the kind that is always technical and rarely criminal enough to be actionable. He had a scheme, which became apparent within the week, that involved purchasing or pressuring landowners in the valley to sell, with the intention of consolidating holdings into a block that could be sold at a significant profit to a railroad surveying team that was reportedly moving through the southern part of the territory. The railroad would pay well for a clear route through the valley, but only if the land could be delivered cleanly, without the complications of existing holdings. Most of the smaller ranchers and homesteaders were being approached with offers that were politely coercive, low enough that they were insulting, but backed by a kind of implicit pressure that the men delivering them were perfectly capable of making the alternative to accepting less pleasant than the offer itself. 2 homesteaders had already sold and left, and the rumors in Dusty Creek were beginning to carry the uncomfortable weight of a situation that was developing faster than it could be addressed. Ellen heard about it first from Tamaz, who heard it from a hand on the neighboring Callaway spread, and she heard enough of the details to understand the scope of it. She was sitting with the Ledgers that afternoon when she heard Edgar come in through the front door of the ranch house, and she came out of the office to find him in the hallway looking tired and angry in the way of a man who has been holding anger in check for several hours. "You have heard about Whitley," she said. "I have," he said, tossing his hat on the hook. "He sent a man out to the ranch this morning while I was at the north pasture, left a written offer with Dora, below market value by a third. I burned the paper. That will not stop him," Ellen said. "No," Edgar agreed, and rubbed the back of his neck with the particular gesture she had come to recognize as his response to a problem he found genuinely difficult. What stops a man like Whitley is law or money or solidarity, and in this county the law is 1 sheriff and 2 deputies, and the nearest federal marshal is 4 days' ride, and money he has more of than anyone in this valley, and solidarity is what I am working on." "What are you doing?" she asked. "Riding to every rancher and homesteader in the valley this week," he said. "If we can get the major landholders to refuse to sell and to refuse to be pressured, the land block that Whitley needs for the railroad deal becomes impossible. He needs contiguous holdings. A single refusal in the right location kills the scheme." "Your land," Ellen said, because she had been looking at maps that Edgar kept in the office and she understood the geography of it, "sits in the middle of the valley. He cannot build a contiguous block without the broken age." "I am aware of that," Edgar said, and there was a calm certainty in his voice that was impressive in its steadiness. "Then he will come harder at you than at the others," she said. Their eyes met, and in that look was a direct acknowledgement of something that had been approaching for some time, not just the situation with Whitley but the other thing, the thing that lived underneath the professional arrangement and the proper distances and the long evenings of talking about books. "I know that too," he said quietly. "Then you need more than a burning letter," she said. "You need documentation. You need all your accounts in perfect order. You need a record of ownership that is ironclad, and you need to be able to demonstrate in any court that this ranch is a going and prosperous concern that has operated continuously and legally. If Whitley wants to come at you legally, the best defense is a set of books that tell a story he cannot contradict." Edgar looked at her for a long moment. "You have been thinking about this," he said. "Since Tamaz told me this morning," she said. "It is what I can do. I cannot ride to the neighboring ranches and I cannot face down a man like Whitley in the street, but I can give you the most defensible set of accounts in Crockett County." Something shifted in his expression, something that moved behind his dark eyes and changed the quality of the way he was looking at her. "Ellen," he said, and the way he said her name, not Miss Morgan, just her name, was different from anything before. "Go ride to your neighbors," she said, because she recognized the moment, but she was not ready for it yet, not quite. "Come back with their agreement to hold. I will have everything in order when you return." He held her gaze for another second, and then he nodded and picked his hat back up and went out, and she stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the office doorframe, breathing carefully. He rode for 3 days, visiting every rancher and homesteader and small farmer who had land in the valley. He came back with commitments from 11 of the 14, which was more than he had hoped, and the 3 who would not commit were on the periphery where their land was less essential to Whitley's scheme. He was dusty and tired, and he had a bruise along his jaw from an encounter with one of Whitley's men on the road back, which he explained briefly as a disagreement that resolved itself, and which Ellen cleaned and dressed in the kitchen while he sat very still and stared at the wall, and she did not ask more about it because she could see it had not been entirely minor. "You should have told the sheriff," she said, working carefully around the bruise. "I did," Edgar said. He noted it. Whitley's man says Edgar threw the first punch, which is not true, but it is also the kind of disagreement that is exactly as difficult to resolve as Whitley wants it to be. Ellen set down the cloth and looked at the bruise, which was purpling nicely along his cheekbone. "You were right about the books," he said, not looking at her, still addressing the wall. "Whitley sent a man to the county recorder to look into the title history on the Broken H. My foreman who went to California. I have been lax about updating certain records. There may be a technical challenge to the title if someone goes looking with the right kind of purpose." "Then we fix it," Ellen said. "I have the ledgers. I have the sale records and the original title documents that were in the desk. We go to the county recorder ourselves and make sure every piece of the record is complete and current and accurate." He turned and looked at her then, with the bruised cheek and the tired eyes and that particular quality of attention that she had learned to read as something significant. "Why are you doing all of this?" he asked, quietly. The question was simple, but it had weight, and they both knew the weight. Ellen sat down across from him at the kitchen table because she was not going to have this conversation standing up as though it were a quick exchange, and she folded her hands on the table and looked at him. "Because it matters," she said. "This ranch matters. What you have built here matters. The people who work here matter. Tomas matters. And," she said, and she held his gaze steadily, "you matter to me. Which I did not plan for, and I am not entirely sure what to do with, but it is true, and I am not going to pretend it is not simply because the timing is inconvenient." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the late afternoon was putting golden light through the west window. Edgar Haskins, who was not a man who expressed himself easily or quickly, looked at Ellen Morgan across that kitchen table for a long moment, and then he said, "I have been trying to find the right way to say something to you for the better part of 2 months. I kept deciding it was not the right time or not my place, or that you might not feel the same, and that the work arrangement was valuable enough not to risk on something uncertain." "And now?" Ellen asked. "And now I think the thing I want to say is more important than whether or not it is uncertain," he said. "Ellen, I have never in my life met a woman who makes me feel simultaneously more competent and more aware of my own deficiencies. You are extraordinary. The way you think, the way you work, the way you are honest about things that most people spend a great deal of energy avoiding. I am in love with you, and I have been for some time, and I would very much like to know if there is any possibility you feel something similar." She looked at him for a moment, at the bruised jaw and the honest eyes and the man who rode for 3 days to protect his community, and came home and sat in his own kitchen telling her the most vulnerable true thing about himself with the directness of someone who has decided that clear speech is worth the risk. "I told you," she said. "You matter to me. That is my version of what you just said." He reached across the table and took her hand, and that was how it began, not with a dramatic declaration or a sudden impulse, but with 2 honest people at a kitchen table in the late afternoon light of West Texas, deciding that what was true between them was worth building on. They rode to the county seat together the following week, with all of Ellen's carefully organized documents, and spent 2 days with the recorder's office making certain that every element of the title and operational history of the Broken H Ranch was precisely and completely documented. The county recorder, A meticulous man named Howard Graves, who clearly took his work seriously, went through everything with Ellen page by page and confirmed that the record was now complete and legally unassailable. If someone is trying to find a challenge to this title, Howard told them, looking over his spectacles, they are going to have a very difficult time of it. Cord Whitley made one more attempt. He came to the ranch himself this time, in the third week of June, riding in with his two partners in the middle of a working day, dressed better than the occasion required and carrying himself with the entitled confidence of a man who was accustomed to having his weight felt. Ellen was in the office when she heard horses in the yard and Tomaz's voice carrying a note of tension. She came out onto the porch and stood with her arms folded as Edgar walked out from the barn to meet their visitors. "Haskins," Whitley said, staying in his saddle, which was a deliberate choice, "I am prepared to increase my offer considerably. You are a practical man. You understand that what I am proposing is good business." "I am a practical man," Edgar agreed, standing with his thumbs in his belt, entirely at ease in the way that genuinely unafraid people are at ease. "Which is why my answer is the same as it was last time. This ranch is not for sale, not at your price or any price. The Broken H is a going concern with clean title and complete records, and if you or anyone working for you makes another move against my land or my people or my neighbors in this valley, I will have the county sheriff, and if necessary the federal marshal involved, and we will have a very thorough conversation about the methods you have been using in this territory." Whitley's expression was the expression of a man who is recalculating. "You are making a mistake," Whitley said. "I make them occasionally," Edgar said. "This is not one of them. You have a good afternoon." Whitley looked past Edgar and found Ellen standing on the porch. He looked at her in the assessing way of a man who is filing information for future use, and then he turned his horse and rode out with his partners behind him. He did not come back. Within 2 weeks, word came through from a rancher on the valley's eastern edge that Whitley had moved on to the next county, where presumably there were people who would be easier to pressure. The solidarity that Edgar had built among the valley's landholders had made the scheme unworkable, and Whitley was a businessman above all else. He went where the business was possible. The valley breathed again, and life went on in the way that life does when a threat has passed, with a kind of lighter quality to ordinary things, the way colors look brighter after a long illness. Edgar and Ellen's relationship had its own pace and its own propriety. He courted her with the same directness and seriousness with which he did everything, and she allowed herself to be courted with a combination of genuine pleasure and the watchful intelligence of a woman who was not investing her heart in anything she had not thoroughly examined. He brought her wildflowers one afternoon with a complete lack of self-consciousness that she found unexpectedly touching. He took her riding on a Sunday when the country was at its most beautiful, the creekside grass thick, and the mesquite in full leaf, and the sky enormous above them, and they rode side by side without speaking for a mile at a stretch, and the silence was comfortable in the way of two people who do not need to fill every moment with words. He asked about her life in Cincinnati, and she told him without softening it, the difficult years after her father's death, the uncle who had taught her bookkeeping partly out of genuine generosity, and partly because she was available and skilled, and he got work out of it, the very narrow set of options that her circumstances had created, and how the advertisement in the Western Frontier Weekly had looked like a door at the end of a hallway that had no other exits. "Are you glad you came?" he asked. "I am very glad I came," she said, and she met his eyes when she said it, so there would be no ambiguity about what she was glad about specifically. Clara Garrett threw a supper in the second week of July that was nominally in celebration of the defeat of the Whitley scheme, but was actually, as everyone in attendance understood perfectly well, in celebration of the fact that Ellen and Edgar were courting, which was a development that the entire town of Dusty Creek found satisfying in the way that people find satisfying any story whose shape they can see is tending in a good direction. The supper was at the boarding house, and 12 people crowded around Clara's extended table, and there was good beef and good corn and Clara's biscuits, and a dried apple pie that was magnificent. Tomás was there, and the sheriff, a quiet, competent man named Dan Albright who had been born in New Mexico and had the weathered patience of someone who had dealt with all varieties of human behavior without losing his fundamental faith in most of it. There were 3 of the Valley ranchers and their wives, and the blacksmith and his wife, and Horace Finch from the post office. They told stories and they laughed, and someone produced a fiddle and someone else a guitar, and the supper turned into something more musical than it had intended to be. And Ellen danced with Edgar in the cleared space of Clara's parlor, which was not entirely large enough for dancing, but nobody seemed to care. And he held her with a careful propriety and a warmth that coexisted very naturally. And she thought, not for the first time, that what she felt for this man was nothing like what she had imagined love would feel like when she was younger, and had imagined it differently. It was larger and quieter and more grounded in the actual specific person in front of her than she had expected. It had the weight of something real. He proposed to her in August. He did it on the porch of the ranch house in the early evening when the sun was going down in those long West Texas colors, red and gold and a deep burning orange that turned the whole valley into something biblical. And he was not eloquent, being a man who did not use words as decoration, but he was sincere and precise, and what he said was this: "Ellen, I want to spend my life with you. I want you to be my wife and my partner in everything I am building here. I know that the life I am offering is hard in some ways, and I know you came west for independence, and I want you to know that I have no interest in changing that about you. Your independence is not a condition I am tolerating. It is part of what I love most about you. I am asking you to share your life with me because I am a better man in every way for knowing you, and I genuinely believe, that you would find the same true about sharing with me." Ellen looked at him in that burning evening light, and she thought about Cincinnati and the narrow hallway of her options, and the stagecoach, and the dust, and Horace Finch's embarrassed sympathy, and the chaotic ledgers, and the supper in the storm, and Cord Whitley riding away, and Tomás's cheerful running commentary, and Clara Garrett's direct and generous wisdom, and she thought about all of it as the shape of a road that had led her here to this porch and this man. And she thought that if she had been designing the journey herself, she would not have made it so circuitous or so uncertain, but she was very grateful for the destination. "Yes," she said, "I will." He took her hand and held it, and the valley went on burning in the sunset around them, and it was a perfect moment in the way that perfect moments are, not without the knowledge of difficulty on either side of them, but real and complete in themselves. They were married in October, in the small church at the far end of Dusty Creek's Main Street, the one with the peeling white paint that still leaned slightly to the left and apparently had no intention of straightening itself. The minister was a circuit preacher named Father Donnelly, who came through the territory every 6 weeks and performed weddings and baptisms and funerals with equal and authentic solemnity. The whole town came. There was genuinely no exaggeration in this. Everyone who lived in or near Dusty Creek understood that this was the kind of wedding you attended, and they did. Clara Garrett wore her best dress and cried in the cheerful open way of someone who is not at all embarrassed about crying at weddings. Tomás stood up as Edgar's witness with an expression of enormous pride and satisfaction, as though he had personally arranged the entire event. The Valley ranchers came with their wives and their children, and there were flowers from the creek bank arranged in tin cans along the window ledges, and someone had whitewashed the fence outside the church that morning, and the October sky was clear and very blue. Ellen wore a dress that she and Clara had remade together from a bolt of good ivory fabric that the mercantile had ordered specially for the occasion, and it was simple and well made, and suited her the way practical beautiful things suited her, without pretension and without apology. Edgar in a clean dark suit looked more formal than she had ever seen him, and faintly uncomfortable about it, which she found privately delightful. And when he saw her come down the aisle of the small church on Clara Garrett's arm, because Clara was the closest thing she had to family in this part of the world, the expression on his face was one that she intended to remember for the rest of her life. Father Donnelly read the vows in his careful, deliberate way, and they said them to each other with the same directness and seriousness that characterized everything between them. And when it was finished and they walked out of the church into the October sunlight, the whole town of Dusty Creek was lined up outside to cheer them, and someone had put paper streamers on the horses, and it was loud and joyful and full of the particular warmth of a community celebrating something it genuinely believed in. The reception was in the long yard behind the Silver Bit Saloon, which the owner, a gregarious man named Pete Calloway, who was no relation to the ranching Calloways, had closed for regular business, and turned over to the celebration with the tables set outside and a whole steer on a spit, and a barrel of cider, and the fiddle player, and the guitar player from Clara's supper, and a third musician who played harmonica with extraordinary commitment. They danced until the stars were out, and Ellen danced with Tamaz, who was a very enthusiastic if not entirely accurate dancer, and with Clara, who was both enthusiastic and accurate, and with 3 of the Valley ranchers who all held her at the respectful distance of men who had been properly raised, and finally and most lastingly with Edgar, who held her closer in the dark, cool October air, and moved with that same deliberate grace that she had first noticed in the corral with the cutting horse, and said quietly into her hair, "You are my wife." "I noticed," she said. He laughed, that full, genuine laugh that transformed his face, and she thought that she would spend the rest of her life working to produce that laugh as often as possible. Life on the Broken H as Ellen Haskins settled into the new shape of itself with a naturalness that surprised her slightly, because she had expected the adjustment to feel larger. But the ranch had been familiar to her for months before the wedding, and Edgar's ways were known to her, and Dora and Tamaz and the other hands had accepted her as part of the household long before it was formalized. What changed was the quality of belonging. Before, she had been indispensable. Now she was home. She kept the accounts, which was never in question. She also began, quietly and without particular declaration, to take on some of the broader management decisions that had previously been handled by the foreman position that had gone unfilled since the California departure. Edgar noticed and adapted his operations accordingly, and they developed a working partnership that was entirely natural to who they both were. Him on the land with the cattle and the horses and the daily physical management of the range. Her in the office and in the broader strategic thinking about what the ranch was and where it was going. She wrote to her uncle in Cincinnati in November, a letter that was long and carefully composed, telling him the whole story from the beginning, and she received back a letter in January that was surprised and pleased, and carried the particular tone of a man who is doing his honest best to understand a situation that is foreign to his experience, but who is trying because he has genuine affection for his niece. He sent, with the letter, a handsome account ledger bound in green leather that was the best quality she had ever handled. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a cold one by Texas standards, with ice in the creek for 3 weeks in January, and a snowstorm in February that was talked about in Dusty Creek for years afterward as the storm that covered the Mesquite to the Second Branch. Ellen spent it learning the land in its winter aspect, which was different and quieter than the summer, and she spent it also simply being married to Edgar Haskins, which involved learning a man in all his dimensions at close range, his silences and his habits and his humor and the specific way he preferred his coffee, and the books he read in the evenings, and the fact that he was constitutionally incapable of walking past a hurt animal without stopping to do something about it. That last quality produced, in February of 1879, a situation that began when Tamaz brought in a half-frozen yearling coyote that he had found in the snow near the north pasture fence, its leg caught in a wire snare. Edgar freed the leg and splinted it, and they kept the coyote in a box by the stove for 2 weeks, which Dora tolerated with the long-suffering patience of someone who had accepted that this was the kind of household she worked in. The coyote recovered and was released in the spring, and in the weeks between catching it and releasing it, Ellen watched Edgar tend to it every morning before anything else, and she found this quietly and completely wonderful. She was expecting their child by March, which she told Edgar on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen over breakfast, with the same directness she brought to everything, saying, "I believe I am with child, and based on when I think it began, the baby should arrive in the fall." Edgar set down his coffee cup. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I am reasonably certain," she said. "I have been paying attention to the signs for the past 3 weeks to be sure I was not mistaken before I told you." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and took both her hands in his in a gesture that she had come to love because it was his truest gesture, the one that bypassed all the careful deliberateness and went straight to what he actually felt. "Ellen," he said. "I know," she said. He sat down beside her and kept her hands, and the morning light came through the kitchen windows, and outside the spring was beginning in the valley, the creek running clear, and the grass coming back in the long green waves it always came back in, and it was a very good morning. Clara Garrett was, predictably, overjoyed. She had been waiting for this news with the composed impatience of someone who is very interested in a situation, and is relying on their dignity to prevent them from being overt about it. When Ellen told her on her next visit to Dusty Creek, Clara hugged her with a thoroughness that left no doubt about her feelings, and then immediately began discussing practical preparations with the efficiency of a woman who had been thinking about this hypothetically for some time and was now ready to act. Tamaz, when Edgar told him, removed his hat and held it over his heart with the expression of a man receiving genuinely wonderful news, and then said something in Spanish that was evidently congratulatory and warm, and then shook Edgar's hand with both of his and went off to tell the other hands, from whom there was a general sound of approval from the direction of the bunkhouse that carried clearly to the house. The pregnancy progressed through the summer with the ordinary and extraordinary qualities of such things. Ellen did not slow down substantially, being unwilling to approach her own health as an excuse to do less, but she did accept certain practical adjustments with good grace, riding less in the later months and spending more time in the office, which was honestly not a hardship because the ranch business was expanding and there was always more to do. They had discussions, those long evening conversations on the porch that had become one of the central pleasures of the marriage, about what kind of parents they would be and what kind of childhood they wanted for this child. Edgar spoke about wanting the child to know the land in the way that he had known it, with the bones, deep intimacy of someone who had grown up in direct relationship with the ground and the weather and the seasons. Ellen spoke about education and books and the importance of knowing more than one kind of world. They did not disagree about any of this, which was not because they agreed on everything. They did not, but because they were both describing things that were genuinely compatible. One evening in late July, they sat on the porch after supper as the day cooled and the stars came up, and Ellen asked, almost idly, whether he had thought about what they would name the child. "If it is a boy," Edgar said, with the consideration of a man who has actually thought about this, "I would like to name him James, after my grandfather. He was a good man and it seems right to pass the name on." "James Haskins," Ellen said, trying it. "I like it, and if it is a girl—" "I thought I would leave that to you," Edgar said. "You have better judgment in most matters of this kind." "High praise," Ellen said. "It is accurate," he said simply. She named the girl Possibility, in the privacy of her own consideration, after her own mother, who had died when Ellen was 14, whose name had been Frances, and whom Ellen had loved with the complete uncomplicated love of a child who did not yet know that parents were complicated. Their son was born on the 14th of October, 1879, exactly 1 year and 4 days after their wedding. He arrived in the bedroom of the ranch house with a midwife from Dusty Creek in attendance and Clara Garrett, who had come out 2 days before and was now a permanent and indispensable presence. And the whole process was, as these processes are, a trial and a wonder simultaneously. Edgar remained nearby throughout, not in the room as there was no place for him there, but in the hall and then on the porch. And when Dora came to find him and brought him inside to meet his son, the look on his face was the most unguarded thing Ellen had ever seen from him, a complete and total openness, a man with every careful defense simply laid down. James Haskins was small and loud and had his father's dark eyes already showing, and when Edgar held him for the first time, standing by the bed in the lamplight, Ellen watched his face and thought that this exact configuration, was what she had come west for without knowing it. "Hello, James," Edgar said very quietly, in the particular voice of a man talking to someone very small and very new and very important. James squinted at him with the profound suspicion of someone recently arrived from somewhere quite different and not yet convinced of this one. "He looks like you," Ellen said. "I hope he has better judgment than me," Edgar said. "You have excellent judgment," Ellen said. "I had 28 years of evidence to the contrary," Edgar said, and the smile that came with it was the full one, the one that changed his whole face. James Haskins grew, as babies do, with the astonishing efficiency of small living things. He grew through his first winter on the Broken H and into the spring of 1880, and by the time the valley was green again, he was sitting up and looking at the world with the same focused intensity his father brought to things, as though taking careful note of everything for future analysis. Tamaz, who proved to have a natural gift with small children, became a devoted and enthusiastic presence in James's life, carrying him around the yard in the mornings when the weather was good, and introducing him to the horses with great seriousness, explaining each animal's name and character as though the infant could appreciate the information, which Ellen privately believed James could, or at least was filing it away. The ranch continued to prosper. The account corrections that Ellen had made in those first weeks had proven their value over and over, and the market timing strategies she had identified had added meaningfully to the Broken H's revenues over the 2 years since their implementation. Edgar had used the increased earnings to improve the stock, bringing in a Hereford bull from a reputable operation in Kansas that significantly upgraded the quality of the Broken H cattle over the following breeding seasons. And he had extended the southern pasture fence to take in a section of creek frontage that he had been negotiating for with patience, and eventually concluded at a fair price. They were building something, together and deliberately, and the fact of building something together had its own quality of satisfaction that was distinct from and additional to everything else. There were hard seasons. The summer of 1880 brought a drought that lasted 8 weeks and cost them a portion of the cattle they had not been able to move to better water in time, and Edgar carried the loss with a practical grief that honored what had been lost without being disabled by it. And Ellen worked the numbers until they had a clear picture of where they stood and a plan for how to recover, and they came through it intact. There was a winter illness in 1881 that went through the bunkhouse and took 2 of their hands out of work for 3 weeks during calving season, and Edgar and Tamaz and Ellen herself worked 16-hour days to manage what needed to be managed. And there were evenings when they were both so tired they simply sat in silence by the fire and said nothing, and it was still enough. There was the ongoing presence of change in the territory. The railroad coming through the Southern Valley in 1882, as it had eventually done despite the failure of Whitley's scheme, changing the rhythms of trade and travel in ways that required adaptation, and they adapted. Through all of it, the marriage deepened in the way that good marriages deepen, not by becoming smoother or easier but by becoming more grounded, more practiced in its understanding of itself, more honest about its difficulties and more certain of its strengths. Clara Garrett sold her boarding house in the spring of 1881, the trade having become more work than she wanted at her age, and Edgar and Ellen offered her a room at the Broken H that she accepted after a negotiation that was entirely for the sake of her pride, because she was not a woman who accepted charity, but which ended with her moving into the large room at the east end of the ranch house and becoming a settled and beloved part of the household in a way that suited everyone absolutely. Clara with James was a particular joy. She was the grandmother he did not have from either of his parents' families, and she provided him with stories and consistent attention and the absolute conviction of his own importance and worthiness that grandmothers are uniquely positioned to give, and James thrived in it. In the spring of 1882, Ellen told Edgar over the breakfast table, with the same directness as before, that she believed they were expecting a second child. Edgar's response was identical in form to the first time, setting down his coffee cup, standing, coming around the table, taking her hands and looking at her with that complete openness. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Excellent," she said. "Tired in the mornings and excellent otherwise." He kissed her forehead, which was his particular gesture of tenderness, the one he offered in moments when he had more feeling than words, and she leaned into it for a moment. "Good," he said. "I am glad." Their daughter, Frances Ellen Haskins, was born in November of 1882, small and fierce, and from the very first hour of her life clearly in possession of opinions about everything, which she expressed with impressive vocal conviction. Edgar held her in the lamplight the same way he had held James 3 years before, with that same total openness, and James, now 3 years old and determined to understand everything about this new situation, stood on tiptoe beside his father trying to see his sister and finally said with great seriousness, "She is very small." "She will get bigger," Edgar told him. "She is very loud," James observed. "She will stay that way," Ellen said from the bed, and Edgar laughed, the full generous laugh, and the room was full of light and warmth and the voices of the family they had built together. Tomás was 23 by then, and courting a young woman from the Mexican settlement 10 miles east of Dusty Creek, a beautiful and serious girl named Lucia, who came to the ranch one Sunday in the spring of 1883 and sat on the porch with the contained dignity of someone who is being assessed and is perfectly confident in the assessment. Ellen liked her immediately and said so, which caused Lucia to relax into a smile that transformed her face the way smiles do when they are genuine rather than performed. Edgar shook Tomás's hand and said something to him in the private way of men who have known each other through work and difficulty, and have a vocabulary of understanding that does not require many words. Tomás and Lucia were married that summer in the settlement, and it was a celebration of a different character than Edgar and Ellen's wedding, larger and more musical and lasting considerably longer, and they attended as guests and were treated with the warm inclusion of people who are genuinely welcome, and it was a very good day. The valley continued to change as the 1880s moved forward. The railroad brought more settlers, and Dusty Creek grew, adding a doctor's office and a second mercantile, and a proper schoolhouse that Ellen had been working toward with the combination of persistence and strategic application of social pressure that she had developed a talent for. James started school in the fall of 1884, a compact and serious 5-year-old with his father's dark eyes and his mother's direct manner of looking at things, and on his first day, Edgar and Ellen walked him to the schoolhouse together and stood at the door watching him go in, and Edgar's hand found Ellen's without either of them deciding to reach for it. "He will be fine," Ellen said. "I know," Edgar said. He was quiet for a moment. "I just did not expect it to feel like this." She squeezed his hand. "Neither did I," she said. The Broken H by 1885 was a substantial operation, one of the most stable and well-regarded ranches in the county, known not only for the quality of its cattle but for the quality of how it was run, the fairness with which the hands were treated, the reliability with which its accounts were kept, the care with which its land was managed. Ellen's role in all of this was well understood in the community, not as an anomaly but as a straightforward fact, and she had come to occupy a particular standing in Dusty Creek not as Edgar Haskins's wife, though she was that and gladly, but as herself, as a person whose judgment was sought and trusted on practical matters of business and sometimes of community. And she was satisfied with this in the deep way of someone who has built the life they chose rather than the one that was assigned to them. One afternoon in early October of 1885, which was the 7th anniversary of the day she had stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek with $11.40 and nowhere to go, Ellen sat on the porch of the ranch house in the late afternoon light with Frances on her lap, the child at nearly 3 now clearly in possession of her own complex agenda for the world, and James playing in the yard with the concentrated focus of a boy who is building something complex and takes it seriously. Edgar came in from the north pasture on his good gray horse and saw her on the porch and changed his direction without hesitation, riding to the house instead of the barn and swinging down and handing the reins to a hand without looking away from her. He came up the porch steps and sat down beside her in the second chair, and Frances transferred herself from Ellen's lap to Edgar's with the casual authority of a child who understands that she has full access to both of them, and he settled her against his chest and looked out over the valley in the late afternoon light that was just beginning to take on the long gold quality of October evenings. "Good day," Ellen asked. "Good day," he said. "North fence is solid. The herd looks strong going into winter. Tamaz says the hay store is better than last year. The accounts look strong," she said. "We will come out of this year in the best shape we have been in since I started the books." He turned and looked at her, and in the look was everything she had learned to read in 7 years of knowing him, the affection and the respect and the humor and the depth, the particular quality of being truly seen by someone who has paid genuine attention. "Ellen," he said. "I know," she said. Frances reached up and patted his jaw with her small hand, and he caught the hand and kissed it, and James in the yard looked up from his construction project and shouted, "Papa, come look what I built," with the urgency of someone whose work is ready for review. Edgar looked at Ellen, who nodded with the slight smile that meant go on, and he stood with Frances still on his hip and walked down the porch steps to where James was waiting with the focused pride of an architect presenting his masterpiece. And Ellen sat in the October light and looked out over the valley, over the land that was home now in the fullest sense of the word, where the creek ran and the grass came back every spring, and the sky was enormous, and the life she had built was exactly the right size for the person she was. Clara came out of the house behind her and sat in the chair Edgar had vacated with the ease of someone who has learned that a good chair in a good spot should never go empty, and the two of them sat in the late afternoon quiet watching Edgar crouch down to look at James's construction with complete and genuine attention, while Frances supervised from her position on his hip with the serious authority she brought to everything. "Content?" Clara asked. Ellen looked at her family in the yard in the golden October light, and she thought about the stagecoach and the dust and the peeling church and Horace Finch's embarrassed hat, and the chaotic ledgers and the storm that trapped her overnight, and the biscuits and the bruised jaw and the kitchen table, and the porch in the burning sunset, and the little church leaning to the left and the stars over the dancing and the October morning, with James's dark eyes and the February coyote, and the green leather ledger and Frances's fierce arrival and Tamaz and Lucia, and all the seasons and the work and the building and the coming through things together, and the depth that accumulated in a life built honestly with a good man. "Very," she said. Clara nodded with satisfaction. "I thought you would be," she said, as though she had always known how the story would go, which perhaps she had. The creek ran clear in the late afternoon light, and the valley was peaceful and golden, and the family was whole, and there was a great deal of future still ahead, enough for more seasons of work and more difficult winters survived together, and James growing into himself and Frances growing into herself, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days that make up a life well lived. The Broken H Ranch stood solid on its land, its accounts in order and its title unassailable and its people cared for. And Ellen Morgan, who had come west with $11.40 and the bravest or most foolish decision of her life, had become Ellen Haskins, which was not the end of Ellen Morgan but the fullest expression of her. And she sat in the October light watching her family with the settled, certain, unshakable happiness of a woman who built exactly what she came here to build. The cottonwood by the creek was turning gold in the autumn air. The cattle were moving to the lower pasture in the long, unhurried way of animals that know the day is good. Tomaz's voice carried from the bunkhouse in the direction of a song he was probably singing to himself without realizing it, something in Spanish that was cheerful and a little mournful at once, the way good songs often are. The evening star was just becoming visible above the western mesa in the last of the daylight. And Edgar stood up from James's construction project and turned and looked at Ellen on the porch with the expression she knew best and loved most. And she smiled at him, and he smiled back, and Dusty Creek went quiet around them in the beautiful, ordinary way of home.